So the Taoists say, well, you know, the chaos issue, well, you just can't tolerate too much of that. What your body does when it doesn't know what's going on is basically prepare you for anything that might happen. You know, and that's the generalized stress response, and that's associated with massive release of cortisol, and that puts you on alert, and that's great. You're awake and ready, but, you know, a couple of years of that and you're old. Your body just cannot tolerate that level of energy expenditure on a constant basis. It wears you out, it makes you old, fundamentally. So, bored or terrified, those are sort of the extremes of chaos and order, let's say. If you're on the line down the middle, well then you're secure enough so you're not experiencing a level of negative emotion that's intolerable. A little apprehension, that might be a good thing. You know, imagine that you're preparing to meet someone that you're interested in. Well, is the apprehension a good part of that or a bad part? Like, would you do without that? Well, you might if it's like paralyzing you to the point where you can hardly even go through with talking to them. But if it's just part of expectation, that's part of excitement. You know, so when you're on that border between chaos and order, you don't want to be so orderly that you're entirely comfortable. And that's partly because you're asleep then. Like, why the hell do you have to be awake if everything's going your way? You know, and if you're driving home in your car and nothing is going on, you're kind of not even there. You know, maybe you're thinking about things in the future, but you're certainly not attending in any real deep sense to what's going on around you. And that's because you don't have to. Well, when you're a little apprehensive, well then you're more conscious, you know, and then you're more engaged in reality. And then there's the positive emotions that are associated with that too, which is excitement and enthusiasm and curiosity and hope. And all those things are, in some sense, all those things are worth living for. And part of the reason that the Taoists believe that you should walk the line between chaos and order is because it's at that place where the quality of your existence is high enough so that the problems that we discussed, the existential problems we discussed, are no longer particularly relevant. And you know, you might say, well, what's the meaning of life? And I might say, well, you can't really ask that question linguistically, because there isn't a linguistic answer, just as the problem itself isn't linguistic, right? Suffering is not the word suffering. Suffering is something that you embody. And meaning is not the word meaning. It's something that happens to you. And so the Taoists would say, well, stand on the line between order and chaos. You can tell when you're there because you're awake and alert and excited and enthusiastic and deep into the moment. And that's a good place to be. And I think the reason that your nervous system does that to you, and this is an evolved issue, is that your brain wants you to be on the line between order and chaos, because that's where dynamic stability is best attained, right? Because your problem is, how do you maintain yourself, right? And then the problem is, how do you maintain yourself optimally? And then the problem is, how do you maintain yourself optimally in a world that continues to transform? And the answer to that isn't, well, you stand still. The answer to that is you transform yourself at the rate that keeps you in sync with the transforming environment. And since we're adapted to transforming environments, there's no reason to assume that when you feel the best about what you're doing, so to speak, there's no reason to assume that that's not exactly where you should be. Why else would you feel like that? Engaged and interested and not plagued by a surfeit of, say, existential problems. And so then meaning becomes something you discover and attempt to inhabit rather than some conceptual answer to a conceptual problem. So it's a very interesting idea, and I think the psychophysiological evidence for its validity is quite strong. You know, we talked about how the hypothalamus is constructed, for example. We know that the hypothalamus is concerned with a lot of the basic things that you need to do to survive, so it's always throwing up these little motivated schemes through which you have to view the world. Fine, you have to deal with those, but when you have dealt with them, it defaults to mild exploration, and that's governed by, by pain and by fear and by disgust, because you can't have your exploration be entirely unbridled. But the optimal state of existence looks like something like engaged interest with what's going on without too much apprehension. Now, not with zero apprehension, because the apprehension also wakes you up a bit. And that's the place where information flow is maximized. That's the place where you become more than you currently are, and that's the place where your description of the world becomes deeper and deeper than the one you already have. So that's the place where you get to have your cake and eat it too. Sufficiently secure, but also engaged in a game that ensures that that security maintains itself across time. So you know, if your life is composed of order and chaos in a sense, and that's part of your fundamental existential problem, how to deal with chaos, how to deal with too much order, in some sense, your nervous system already sets you up for that. Now, and that's associated with some of the deeper ideas that have been put forward by people like Jung, and then to a lesser degree by people like Rogers and Maslow, who believed in something like human potential or human self-actualization. And Jung's idea was a deeper idea than that, was that when you're operating on the border between order and chaos, and you're interested in something, that's when you're where you are. That's when you're there. You're interested in something and you're captivated by it. Jung would then say, if you try to stay there, which means you follow that, it will take you to all the places that you don't want to go. It'll take you to all the places in your past that you haven't made complete use of, and it'll take you to all those places that you're avoiding in the future and the present. That's what that mechanism is for. And the reason it'll do that is because with all those experiences that you've had in the past that you've avoided or you haven't made thorough use of, there's still sort of latent world left there. So, you know, you see this with people in their relationships. It's like, say a woman is going out with an abusive guy. She finally drops him. And it's like, boom, next relationship. Oh, look, it's another abusive guy. And then she drops him. And then the next relationship, it's like, it's another abusive guy. And Freud called that the repetition compulsion. But you might think, well, what is missing in her worldview that makes it such that when she acts, she keeps running into the same obstacle? It's like her map isn't correct. And so then you might say, well, if she went back to the first relationship and really dug around in the carcass, so to speak, she might find out what the hell she's missing. One thing might be, well, when exactly do you say no? And how do you say it? You know, because abuse, for example, usually starts out, it rarely starts out that the person is calm and then you end up pounded flat. The fundamental problems of life are existential. It's what to do. The solutions to those problems are not arbitrary. The wisdom traditions of mankind and the profound psychological theories that we've collected over the last 200 years, they converge. You know, one of the things they say is, get your story straight. Another thing they say is, if you're avoiding something that you need to do in order to get to where you're going, quit avoiding it. Because the avoidance will cause you trouble. It'll weaken you, and it'll make the world into a more terrible place. And then the broader sociological, psychological studies, like the ones that were done by people like Solzhenitsyn, who, as you know, isn't generally utilized in a personality class, but he's sort of like a meta Viktor Frankl, as far as I'm concerned. You know, Solzhenitsyn lays out another problem with all of this, which is, well, if you don't do this, if you don't get your story straight, and you don't stop avoiding, well then, well, what's the consequence? And one consequence is, well, you're a miserable thing with a very low quality life, and so you're just going to be tortured by existence, and it's perfectly capable of torturing you beyond your endurance. And that sort of sucks for you. But the next step beyond that is, well, you become the sort of person who isn't really all that positively predisposed to existence. And once you're that sort of person, then anybody who comes along to offer you the opportunity to live inside something rigid and hurt anyone who comes near, you're going to jump on that. Partly because you're afraid, and they offer you security, and partly because you're resentful and bitter and full of hatred, and so you're just waiting for the bloody opportunity to take that out on someone, especially if you can act morally and superior while you're doing it. You know, and you think, well, that's basically what Hitler offered the Germans, and that's basically what Stalin offered the communists. It was an inversion of the order, and anybody who was pathologically resentful had the opportunity to be just as murderous as they wanted to be. And so, you know, the 20th century put towards us a whole variety of problems. One problem was the problem of meaning. You know, Nietzsche sort of announced that at the end of the 19th century. And then the 20th century was, well, what do we do about that? And a lot of it was nihilistic, and a lot of it was totalitarian. And both of those seem to be not so good. You know, and for me, especially in the universities, the nihilism hasn't ended. It's still infested most of the humanities. But the nihilism and the totalitarianism, they are not the only opportunities. They're not the only options. And you know, it is possible for people to pay attention to their lives in such a way that they straighten out. And if you straighten out, man, you get tough. And you get useful. And if you're tough and useful, then life isn't so horrible. Or even if it is, you can hack it. You know, because making life not horrible, you'll have limited success with that. But making yourself tough enough so that won't corrupt you, that's a possibility. And then the upside to that is, well, you're not going to be a totalitarian, and you're not going to be nihilistic, and you're not going to be like a primary danger to the structure of the social unit around you. And who knows, maybe it's even better than that. You'll be good for you, that'd be good. You'd be good for your family, that'd be good. You'd be good for your community, that would be good. That's an equilibrated state from the Piagetian perspective, right? You're living so it works for you, it works for your family, it works for your community. God only knows, maybe it even works for the planet. I mean, that would be the hope. Well, that's a pretty good thing to aim at. And the other thing to think about in that regard is, life is hard enough, so you need an adventure. You need an adventure to justify it. Like, it has to be worth it. You know, and one real adventure is, see if you can get your act together. That's hard. And it's an adventure. And it's partly an adventure because if you make that your primary goal, say, to not avoid things, to tell the truth, to aim at the highest value, things start to happen to you. They're not things that you're manipulating the world to get. They're just doors that start to open. And God only knows how many doors will open to you if you do that. And that makes things extraordinarily interesting. And once things are extraordinarily interesting, the fact that life has its limitations and that it's full of suffering, you think, yeah, well, you know, all things considered, it's not such a bad bargain. And so to close, one of the things you might ask yourself is, if you're in a situation where your life isn't of sufficient quality, then you might ask yourself, are you doing absolutely everything you can to fix it? And then you might say, well, let's not draw any final conclusions about the utility of existence and its value until we're sure we've got our act together and are seeing things straight. And that's worth pursuing. That's what you should be learning in university. You know, because that's the proper path of a citizen. It's the proper path of someone who's attempting to put the world straight. And that's the best thing you can do. And it's not only because it's right. It's because what's right is actually what's best for you. So that's what I've learned from the stuff I've been teaching you. So thank you.